All right. Welcome everyone to our second Mapineq seminar. Mapineq is the abbreviation for Mapping Inequalities Through the Life course. And this is a EU-funded project led by Professor Jani Erola, who is today here with us. My name is Daniela Vona. I work at Population Europe and have the pleasure to also be part of the Mapineq project and will serve as moderator today. Our seminar will be divided into 3 parts. First, we'll have a short presentations to understand trends and policies related to social mobility. We'll then move on to a panel discussion, followed by the Q&A session. Please make notes of any questions you may have. You have the chance to ask them at the final 15 minutes that we'll have together. All right, so let's get on with our presentations. It's my great pleasure to invite 2 amazing scholars to enlighten us today with their knowledge. Our first speaker is Elina Kilpi-Jakonen. She's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Turku. And after her presentation, we'll learn from Professor Joe Blanden. She's Professor of Economics at the University of Surrey. Elina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And hopefully everyone can see my slides now. So welcome on my behalf as well. And as Daniela mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about trends and regional differences in social mobility. So, I mean, given that it's a very short presentation, it's going to be quite broad brushed strokes on this. So yeah, kind of details can be then discussed in the panel discussion as well. So kind of to start off, some of the major trends in social mobility that we've seen over the past decade. So I'm drawing on chapters that have been written for the research handbook on intergenerational inequality, which came out last month, and is a kind of multidisciplinary effort to kind of understand these topics. And we have chapters there specifically on, say, education, human capital, social class, and income mobility. And based on those chapters, we can say that there has been increasing equality in educational attainment in terms of intergenerational inequality. But when looking at specifically higher educational attainment, so entry into and attainment of higher education, that has been stalling or even decreasing for recent cohorts. When we move on to look at social class mobility, in a number of countries, there has been increasing social class mobility, but again, that has stalled for more recent cohorts. But against this backdrop of kind of increasing but stalling mobility, when it comes to income mobility, intergenerational income mobility, the kind of broad kind of cross-national conclusion is that has remained relatively stable, although there are also countries like the UK, for example, where there's been kind of decline in income mobility and then stabilization. So kind of the caveat that I started with, I'll just say that again. So these are kind of major trends across a number of countries, and the countries that this kind of is specifically about are high income global north countries for which we have the most data. So if we then look at some of the regional differences, so this is work from the Mapineq project specifically, and they've kind of tried to map how intergenerational educational transmission takes place and what are the regional inequalities therein. So this map shows you kind of at the regional level in Europe what the distance is between higher and lower educated children of higher and lower educated parents in terms of their kind of gaining a tertiary degree. And what we can see is that the countries where the colors are kind of more towards the purple, pink and purple are the more equal countries and regions. And the countries where it's more on the yellow side are the more unequal countries. So we can see here that in general, kind of Northern Europe, some Western European countries are on the more equal side, and then Southern European countries and Eastern European countries are on the more unequal side. But there is variation within countries across regions, and this variation tends to be larger in the countries that are generally more unequal. So the Southern European and to some extent Eastern European countries as well. And these authors have also looked at whether these regional differences change over time or not. And at least the preliminary results there suggest that over time, the within-country differences have reduced slightly, although the across-country or between-country differences have remained largely stable. And then if we look at income mobility and regional differences therein, so this is again from the research handbook that we've published, and bringing together a number of individual country studies. What we can see here are kind of histograms of how the parent-child income rank slope differs across regions. And the dashed vertical lines indicate the kind of median within each country. So we can see here that the US tends to have more or less income mobility, whereas, say, Sweden, for example, has more income mobility. And then kind of the spread within countries is much larger in Canada and the US compared to the European countries. Although then there's the question of, well, are the kind of regions comparable? And that's something that should be kept in mind with the European results as well, is that kind of these are on slightly different geographical scales as well. But interestingly, kind of putting together these income comparisons in Canada and the US and also Australia, the regions with the least mobility tend to be the kind of hardest to reach, more secluded regions. Whereas, for example, in Sweden, the region with the least mobility is Stockholm. So the kind of mechanisms going on there might be slightly different. And then kind of my final point in this presentation is to discuss a bit further the role of education. So in both economics and sociology, education is seen to be, on the one hand, a key outcome in itself, but also a mediator between parents and children's socioeconomic outcomes. But it's interesting to kind of relate the trends in kind of educational inequalities with those in social class mobility and income mobility, since we see that kind of educational expansion, we know from research as well that educational expansion is a key driver of social class mobility trends. But at the same time, we know that it doesn't fully translate into increased social class mobility, because on the one hand, there tends to be a reduced effect of educational occupational attainment with educational attainment, or with educational expansion, I mean. And on the other hand, in some instances at least, there's also an increase in the so-called direct effect of parental social class when this educational equalization takes place. And as we've seen, kind of educational expansion hasn't really translated into increased income mobility on the other hand. And also in general, education tends to explain less of income mobility than it does of social class mobility. So I thank you at this stage and give the floor to Jo.
I'm out of mute now. Let's grab this. Nothing seems to be happening, leading to slight stress. Not sure what's going on there. Sorry about this. What can you see? Elina,
there seems to be something on top of your Adobe Acrobat.
Yeah, that's the thing that I can't work out what it is. Hang on. Let's do that. Does that work?
Yeah. And now control
I
L.
don't know what that was. Okay, it was just there to bother me, I think. Okay, thank you very much, Elina. So I'd like to really move on from Elina's talk by really focusing on this issue of education and human capital. So as she's already mentioned, we can think of to some extent as today's education inequalities as being tomorrow's income inequalities. So those from richer family backgrounds tend to do better in education, and those who do better in education earn more. Now, the exact way that this plays out in terms of the contribution to intergenerational mobility is very much as Elina just said. If education reinforces existing inequalities, then it's likely to lead to more intergenerational persistence, whereas education somehow manages to break those, for example, by an expansion of education, which is equally shared across the population, then you tend to see education tend to be seen as an equalising force in this literature. So generally, it's seen that education accounts for about 50 to 60% of earnings persistence. So that means that the relationship between parental income and the child's adult earnings, we can actually say that around about 50–60% of that relationship can be explained by the fact that kids from richer backgrounds have better educational outcomes. But there's an enormous amount underneath that. So as Elina said, often people just kind of think very carefully about this relationship between education across generations, but we also want to kind of go behind that. And many chapters in the handbook that we're both referring to really get behind the skin of these relationships and look at the mechanisms. And I'm going to talk as an economist very much here, being underpinned by the contributions of the two Garys, Becker and Solon. And the idea here is that we're thinking about individuals and the way that parents relate to their individual children and make investments in them in a rational way. Now, actually, our book, because it's multidisciplinary, provides some different perspectives on this, thinking about not only the skills as something that can be marketed, but also as something that gives a hierarchy. And indeed thinking about the investments parents make as not being perhaps entirely rational. So, there is a behavioural aspect to the way that we're considering this as well. But what we often think about as well, underlying this is this very much economic model of human capital investment. And indeed, the literature recognises that the differences between between children from different backgrounds can be there without parents doing anything at all. And one aspect that researchers are increasingly looking at is the role of genes, and indeed the way that we can understand this role of genes. But even beyond that, we then think about whether the investments that are made by families and by the state reinforce those initial differences or are able to compensate them. So our book very much thinks about private investments and public investments, and hopefully we're going to talk much more about these private and public investments in our policy discussion that follows this. So we think about genes, we think about very early life, indeed kind of perinatal and prenatal investments. We think about parenting, preschool and schooling, and all of those aspects are places where we could look for policy investments which could potentially break these intergenerational links. And a nice aspect I think of that we might want to think about when we look at the broad picture here is, well, okay, we've got various places we could make interventions, but where are the places where we want to concentrate? And I know other panelists are going to talk about this in a little while, but I thought it might be nice to give a little bit of a framework for this. So one way to think about it is think about, well, how large are the differences between rich and poor children in these different aspects? We think that parenting is quite important, and we can see that there are important differences in parenting between richer and poorer children, but we might also want to think about how hard those impacts are to change. So, we think parenting makes a difference, but actually, how easy is it to encourage parents to perhaps act in a slightly different way? Another aspect of this we might want to think about is if government takes an intervention, how easy is it for government to scale up and act upon that intervention to cross the whole population? And one thing that might be quite interesting to think about here are these behavioural aspects and the extent to which kind of nudges and low-cost interventions such as text messages and apps could really make a difference. So although we might think that that's a small intervention in terms of the overall things that parents do, it might be one that actually is quite easy to act upon and easy to scale across the whole population. So these are the kind of things that we want to think about. So I'm just going to wrap up by thinking about the fact that human capital and skills are only one part of the story. Okay, so we have a framework in our mind, particularly as economists, that skills are rewarded in the labour market, parents contribute to skills, and the labour market is where we get returns to these skills, which are going to be important for our economic well-being. And this indeed is why we care about this whole idea of intergenerational mobility. But this is clearly a really narrow approach in several ways. We might care about specific aspects of economic well-being more than others. Unemployment, for example, because of its effects on mental well-being, poverty, because it can limit people's ability to contribute to society, and another nice contribution that's in the book, the role of elites, and potentially the power of those elites are particularly important for the way that democracies operate. So we might be particularly interested in the way that access to the elites plays out. In fact, this is something that's really important in the current UK election campaign, because there's been a lot of discussion as to whether the state should impose further taxes on private schools, or certainly reduce the tax exemption for private schools. So we can see that playing out right now. We might also want to think that economic well-being is not the only thing we care about. We could think about that more broadly. One way of thinking about that is health. And also that this narrow idea of parents and children might not be quite what we want to think about. We talk about that in the edited volume. And very importantly, and this is highlighted in several places in emerging literature, that the very narrow relationship between fathers and sons, being focused on because those two were seen as the primary labour market actors, might need a little bit of a rethink, and several of our chapters consider that. One last thing that I'm going to just add quickly is we don't have that much to say about wealth when we're thinking about these patterns. Wealth is outstripping earnings growth in many countries and potentially becoming an even more important aspect contributing to well-being. So it's really important to understand the extents and mechanisms underpinning wealth transmissions. We're beginning to find that wealth is intergenerationally immobile, but other than that, we haven't got quite enough to say about that. And again, this really highlights how important data is to this whole endeavour. And we see a lot of contributions in the volume about where data has made a considerable difference. And I know we have a few people active on that on the call, so better data is always extremely useful for finding out both the extent of intergenerational persistence and the mechanisms that lie behind it. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Jo. So without further comments, apart from a big thank you for the brilliant presentation, I would like to move on to our panel discussion now. And we have with us amazing scholars, both from sociology and economics. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Jani Erola. He's professor of sociology at the University of Turku and director of the Invest Research Flagship Center. Markus Jäntti, he's professor of economics at the Swedish Institute for Social Research at the Stockholm University. Professor Lindsey Macmillan, she's professor of economics at the Social Research Institute and director of the Center for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities at the University College London. And I'm not sure if Rebecca made it. Rebecca, are you here with us? I cannot see your name. Well, I think she's not here, but we keep the fingers crossed that she'll join us in the meeting. So let's start this conversation. And I would like to start by coming back to something that you mentioned, Joe. And I think is extremely important for the Mapineq project, and something that the consortium is really investing time and energy into, which is multidisciplinarity. And Markus, you have compared distinct approaches to study the relationship between individuals' income and education during adulthood and their family background. Could you elaborate a bit on how comparing results from these different approaches can provide a more nuanced understanding on the role of family background and their influence on people's life? Is multidisciplinarity thinking paving the way for the future of science? What's your opinion about it?
I think that, I mean, I worked primarily with looking at the economic and the sociological approaches, as in fact has Jo in some of her work on the UK. And I think it's really enlightening to take a serious look at what other social sciences have been doing in this. I think it really deepens our understanding in several different ways. One is that sociology really has a very long and rich tradition in looking at social mobility in a number of different ways, both when it comes to education and occupation. And I've learned a tremendous amount of that work. In fact, one of my next door neighbors at Sophia for the past 15 years has been a grand old man in this tradition, Robert Eriksson, and interacting with him almost on a daily basis really has taught me a lot. But it also allows one to understand more richly what's going on in society. I think the work that Jo did when looking at class-based or occupation-based class mobility and income mobility in the UK was related to a conceptual discussion I had with my colleague Anders Björklund a long time ago, that it's possible, for instance, that class mobility moves in one direction or doesn't move at all, where income mobility moves in a different direction, and analyzing those differences can tell us a lot about how society has been changing. So without understanding what our sociology colleagues have done and really try to implement that in an economics framework as well, I think we lose a lot. I'd love to see more political science-based research on intergenerational persistence and or lack of mobility and so on. There's been really interesting work in the US on inequality in this respect, and I'd really love to see a lot more of that to understand what's happening to our societies.
Thank you, Markus. This is very, very important for us to talk more about, and it's a pity that we don't have enough time, but perhaps we should do another webinar on that. So let's move on to a more practical topic, which is our post-EU election world. We have seen with the election increasing extreme right-wing votes. And I think in the context of social mobility studies, it's important that we take time to reflect about it, because concerns about equality and social mobility is coming up and up into political agendas for good reasons. And so, Jani, perhaps I can ask you, as someone who has studied the study intergenerational effects in political participation in Finland, what have you learned with this analysis? What are your biggest concerns now after EU elections?
So thanks, Daniela. I think one of the interesting findings that we have with in the paper in 2019 was that how strong actually the family background effects are in voting as compared to the typical outcomes that we are looking at, say education, occupation attainment, or income. So there's actually quite a bit of the family background influence in there, and most of that is actually just learning that when parents participate to political decision making, then also the kids will participate to that. And of course that is important in terms of also how the kind of a democracy pans out, that we have to learn also that part of the attainment process, in a sense, how we participate to the society. It's harder to actually reflect what is actually how should we interpret the most recent electoral outcomes in terms of this slide, but definitely we can assume that that those who participate to voting, they also feel that they can also have more influence on, say, how we organize educational systems, or what kind of things we do in order to maintain access to social status, or receiving high or low income in the society.
Thank you. And now I have a question to all of you, and perhaps Lindsey, you could start with your reflections as a great expert in the UK. So if you're in charge of setting a social mobility agenda for your country or for the EU, what would be the key 3 issues that you would prioritize, and how we would monitor progress in this area?
Okay, thanks very much, Daniela. Yeah, I mean, this is a great question as we sit on the precipice of an election, obviously here in the UK. And given that Labour are so far ahead in the polls at the moment, I'm just going to start by slightly misquoting the previous leader of the Labour Party, Tony Blair. When he was standing on the edge of a big landslide victory in 1997, he always went on about education, education, and education. And my 3 would be education, education, and beyond education. So I'm kind of repeating what Jo said, but that's not so surprising since she's been my co-author for 20 years. But first up, the first education is early years. Jo already touched on this, but this is where you get most bang for your buck. So investing in high quality education for young children, and in particular for disadvantaged young children, is a really important place that we should be intervening. Recent evidence by one of the contributors, Gabriella Conti and colleagues, has shown that the Sure Start programmes that were a big flagship policy of the previous Labour government in the early 2000s have actually had strong impacts on the GCSE scores at age 16, and particularly the most disadvantaged children here. Sadly, these programmes have been cut, but the evidence is there now for this to be, a big area of focus going forward. But beyond early years, the second education, we can't forget about the rest of the system. I'm always saying this, there's a lot of talk always about early years because of the influential work in this area. But, these gaps in educational attainment between people from more and less disadvantaged families really widen throughout the schooling system. Research that I've done with colleagues Claire Crawford and Anna Vignoles has shown that high achieving disadvantaged young people fall behind their lower achieving, more affluent peers, particularly as they hit the secondary school system. And sorting into secondary schools seems to be a really important part of the process. So having a big think about the way we admit children into different types of schools, be that by tracking as is common in Germany, I know, or be it through access by house prices. We need to really be thinking about the way in which different children from different backgrounds access different qualities of education. The beyond education point, the way I slightly misquoted Tony Blair's famous 3 educations, is that we also really do know that family background persists beyond educational attainment. So if you look at the labour market, the importance of your family background, if you're comparing 2 individuals with very similar education experiences, someone from a poorer background and someone from a richer background, the person from the richer background on average will be doing better in the labour market. There's a lot going on here, but there seems to be a big agenda around access to and progression within employment opportunities that are happening in the labour market. So I think we've made big steps, at least in the UK, we've made big steps with gender pay audits, but we need to move beyond this to be really thinking about the importance of socioeconomic background in terms of who's getting into jobs and who's getting paid what within occupations too. And really the way that we monitor this is, as Jo said, more data. It's not going to surprise you, we say that as economists, but a big priority of the Labour Party here in the UK is to create better administrative data linkages so that we can understand more clearly. I know that a lot of the countries in Europe are already way further ahead than us on this, but really being able to link children to parents and understand more clearly where and when inequalities are arising in the system is super important for really trying to nail down which parts we can intervene in. Similarly, I think employers for the labour market part of the piece really need to be collecting this data themselves on who's applying to their jobs, who's in their workforce, what the socioeconomic background as well as the race and gender of the people that they're hiring are, so that they can understand where they can intervene and what's happening within their organizations.
Markus, what is your take on that?
I think Lindsey pretty much discussed most of the things where economists can contribute. I would like to add maybe three things. One is about the education, especially the early childhood education, both kindergarten-like activities and primary school. That I think we should really ask those policymakers, politicians who speak about equality of opportunity to take it seriously. Because if it is taken seriously, it might have quite radical implications for how we direct resources. And in particular, we'd massively redirect resources to schools and early childhood education of disadvantaged children, rather than equalizing resources across schools, for instance. I really think it would be really important that if, as very many do, emphasize equality of opportunity, the implications of those really are drawn out by policymakers. The second thing I might emphasize is that I think it's important to think about further education, and again, especially for the disadvantaged, not necessarily by making everybody go into university education essentially, but really devoting resources to allowing also the disadvantaged to really make an informed choice about where they end up, be it vocational training or be it higher education, that essentially invest a lot in essentially guiding students so that they can make informed choices. And again, with an emphasis on directing the resources to the disadvantaged, because the disadvantaged are very good at figuring out where they end up. And finally, a point which might seem a little trivial, but I do think it's important also to support the idea of lifelong learning, not least in facilitating downwards mobility by those who have made kind of very advanced careers, come from an advantaged background, but may want to kind of resettle in midlife to essentially allow that kind of thing to take place, and also for those who discover other interests and so on along their life to be able to, in a supported way, change careers. So I do think that, I mean, Lindsey nailed it with education and beyond. So I think the beyond part is one where I think some additional thinking might go in.
Thank you, Markus, and perhaps Jani can go further on the beyond.
Yeah, I think this is actually interesting that we haven't really kind of coordinated our responses to these questions beforehand, but there's a huge overlap with them, and I guess I also agree that the education, the maintaining the equal access to education at all levels is really the kind of a crucial thing that should be done. But of course, we have to think about a bit further there as well, because I mean, especially we think about say from the Nordic context, where we kind of have settled to the idea that we already provide equal access to all levels of education, but it's just up to the effort that you actually do these choices. But we know that these countries, actually, the educational differences are quite substantial and even increasing in to some extent in some contexts. So I think that there needs to be done more than just providing that, okay, we have these places where you can get educated and just make your best effort, but there has to be some sort of a greater push from the society to actually make this happen. The other thing is that, I mean, when we are changing this, I mean, we have been doing this the educational changes in the education system that is intends to change these systems to more open and making actually sure that this equal access happens better. But at the same time, we have also seen that quite often these changes are primarily, or at least first, benefiting the advantaged family kids, because those families can adapt to these system changes much faster than the disadvantaged families. And this is something that I really would like to emphasize, that when we are actually doing these changes, we just shouldn't just hope that they actually increase equal opportunities. We just have to monitor that actually also happens and think about these mechanisms, how that actually these changes can benefit those who are coming from the most disadvantaged family backgrounds, basically. And the third thing, I think it's more or less what Lindsey already says about the labor markets. I think what we have not, I mean, in intergenerational attainment, we have looked at the, say, final education, final occupational standing of or life course incomes, but we are not really paying too much attention what actually happens in the labor markets, what happens during the careers. And I think this is still a kind of a black box that we have to think about. And actually, we should think that how that kind of pans out across the life courses as a kind of a consistent inequalities, because actually quite a big chunk of the lives we are in the labor market, or potentially at least should be in the labor market. And after that, in the pension, that actually depends quite a bit what you can do during the pension period, is that what you actually gather during the time in the labor market. So in that sense, I think this should be the next step to look at, especially from the policy point of view, what is actually happening in there. What is clearly thing that I think also that just having more data is not enough. That's the first step, that we have to have access to the data to monitor these things. But again, we know them, the Nordic countries, that we have had data for, I don't know, 20, 30 years now, more or less. And actually, there's not that much more information or the knowledge about this process from these countries than from everywhere else. So we also have to make sure that we have people who are able to use and analyze this data, and that's much harder task. We have to kind of push our students also to make use this data and make sure that they actually go to these policy jobs, and then that they also are able to use the data for their own good and for society's good, I guess.
Thank you, Jani. And if panelists and speakers would like to react to each other, please feel free to jump in. And perhaps, Joe, you could add something about the housing market in the UK. How do you see the situation as a beyond element in this story?
That just felt like that was something that was sort of missing, because I mentioned at the end we mustn't get completely stuck on the labour market, and then we did in the discussion. I mean, I think the UK is probably, and the US are probably worse on this than some other nations, but we can see that actually the intergenerational transmission of wealth is stronger than the intergenerational transmission of earnings. So that means that there's something going on beyond what's happening in the education system, which means we need to think carefully about inheritance tax. We need to think carefully about access to housing markets, which is a huge issue in the UK with the focus on owner occupancy. Maybe a European seminar, this is not such a big issue as it would be in the UK, but it's something that's leading to a lot of thought. And it's also an area where data so far hasn't helped us that much, because we don't have great data on wealth, apart from I think in the Swedish case. So we really need to think more carefully about this. The whole story is not just education. There is also this beyond the labour market piece as well.
I could actually jump in there, and actually the kind of wealth in Sweden is an interesting case in point. There's a very good a committee sat and thought about how to construct a really good register of wealth for Sweden, and with very detailed plans. But certain interest groups, especially the banks and employers association, turned against this, and the right-wing populists kind of latched on to that, and in part with the argument that creating such a register is a first step into reintroducing a wealth tax. So now this proposal is in fact in limbo for right-wing populist reasons. I would like to add something which I think is important in the policy discussion. It's important to realize how long the time lags is. So Lindsey mentioned the early childhood education investments that had been made in the UK and then reversed that were put in, I think, the early 2000s. Comprehensive school reform in Finland was legislated in 1968 and implemented during a 4-year phase in the mid-1970s. 40 years after the legislation was passed, the paper was published, which showed that it massively reduced intergenerational persistence of income. That's 10 parliaments. That's 10 parliaments. So when talking with policymakers, it really is important that these kinds of things, it's really difficult to demonstrate convincingly for your electorate that you've succeeded in doing this, but in a sense, trying to emphasize the importance of really thinking long-term in this and trying to get politics really to take that discussion seriously, I think is quite a challenge, to put it mildly.
Thank you for this very important comment. Lindsey, you would like to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to react to that. Such an important point made by Markus. And I think that one of the things we've been scratching our head about here in this country, with the constant changing of policies that's been going on, is whose role is it, right, to be the keeper of the policies that do actually spread across multiple different parliaments, without being any threat to democracy. A civil service, I guess, plays an important role in this, but I don't know that anywhere has kind of got this right yet in terms of the really long-term strategic thinking. It's almost building a consensus across all of the major political parties. But as we see things become, increasingly more polarized, it's really tricky, I think, to really get a handle on how we really get this agenda going so that it does have that thought that, this kind of long-term plan instead of this very short approach.
Jani.
Yeah, I think that's true. The question is who should do it, but it's definitely in the interest of the middle class who does decides the votes anyway. So I think there's definitely a mandate, but I guess it might be also the kind of a tricky for the political actor to jump in because the returns are shown like decades after you were in potentially power, and that's of course make it harder. You want to have some sort of a quicker outcomes of that, quicker results out of that. But maybe just to add Markus, you said that it took 30 years to get the results, but actually it should have been possible to get some of the results already much earlier if we had the data at the time. And that was made only available in the mid-90s. So we could have been potentially seeing some of the outcomes of the compulsory school renewal only in the mid-80s if that if there would have been data sources for that purpose.
All right, now I'm inviting the audience to raise the hands to ask questions if you have, or chat to the discussion if you would like to, and we'll keep the conversation going. And so you can raise your hand at any time and contribute and ask your questions. But I have another question, which follows up onto the discussion we are having now. Slightly in a different perspective. So imagine that I am the mayor of a 10,000 inhabitants village in Germany, and I want to do more for education and need arguments in my to raise the arguments in my community. How would you advise me to proceed? How should I argue to get more money directed to education in my municipality? Apart from the obvious arguments that education is good.
I'll say something. I mean, I think we increasingly have much better evidence in the past than we did about what specifically works. And that's something that we spend a little bit of time on in one of the chapters of the book. You're talking about, so I think maybe the important thing here is to remember the power of evidence. So if you go to, you know, people and say, actually, if you gave us this money, we could spend it on, for example, tutoring. It's been shown to be quite important, especially in the aftermath of COVID. And if we do tutoring, we actually know how to do it well as well now, partly because when we first did it in the UK, we didn't do a particularly good job. So actually, social science can be incredibly powerful at providing the evidence to enable the best policies to be implemented. So I think that, you know, that would be a great approach. I mean, we've also heard the example of Sure Start. I mean, a little late in the day, but the argument that's built there for that has been powerful, and hopefully might be something that we see come back on the strength of that. So it shows that social science can matter.
Very nice. Christian and Louis-André, I'll come back to you, just allowing Jani and Lindsey to add to this question, and then we move to you. Jani, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess it's a usual thing that, okay, that if you are in the in that kind of a position, you have to make sure that everybody thinks that they benefit from this. And I think this is, of course, the big question, how to frame that. If we know that quite often these policies has to be quite targeted. So how are these targeted policies actually benefiting everything? And there you need a bit of a political imagination for that, I guess, in order to make that happen, actually. So it's but I think the politicians are good in that, making up those stories as well. So,
Lindsey.
Yeah, I think it also really matters what's kind of the main focal point of people at that time, right? So we've been having a problem getting the kind of education argument across in the UK because there's this really big obsession with lack of economic growth and the productivity slowdown. And then you're just having to tilt and really explain to people very basic economics, which actually having a more educated population will lead to greater productivity growth in the long run, you know? So it's about the way in which you have to think about the angles that are really important at that given time and why education isn't getting the cut through, and then trying to change the narrative based on what we know from basic economic theory about the importance of human capital production in creating, you know, strong economies. So saying that in the simplest possible terms too. So it's quite an art being a politician, I guess. But I think it depends what the kind of main motivation of people at the time, or the main interest of people at the time is.
Thank you, Lindsey. This is very interesting because I'm working in the world of demography, population, and at the European Commission, the main argument now to invest in demography is to increase the competitiveness of European Union. So we are using the competitiveness to pay attention to aging, and it's very interesting how the economic arguments are still the strongest ones, it seems, no? For policy making. Okay, Christian, you are the next one in my list.
Right, thanks for a great seminar. So I have a question, mainly perhaps to Elina, about these regional variation. So one of the things that I think goes unnoticed when you compare like something like rank slopes or other correlation metrics is basically that these different regions also regress to very different means in the outcome distribution. So there's a kind of long run component of inequality that is captured by regional differences that are kind of weeded out. So I know this has been discussed in various ways, but I'm often wondering what do we really learn from these ones? These kind of regional comparisons within a country. I would like some perspectives on that. That would be interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, really good question that I'm not sure I have a very good answer to at this stage, but I think some of the interesting things coming out from the Mapineq project in terms of the regional kind of comparisons is also that, I mean, yes, that. So, for example, if we look at the kind of how well the children of highly educated parents are doing, that seems to be quite constant across countries and regions and time. And the main thing that differs is kind of how far below the children of the lower educated parents are. And obviously the composition of the population in terms of these two groups is then kind of a big driver also in terms of how unequal the mean in these different areas is. So I think in terms of kind of digging down a bit deeper in terms of, well, where do we see the differences and what's kind of driving the differences can give kind of a nice nuanced perspective. But at the same time, I have to say that kind of to the extent that we've been doing these, like the main differences are between countries and the kind of regional variation within countries as far as, I mean, the data here is a big kind of constraint. But to the extent that we've been able to look at it, actually the within country variation is relatively small, and the bigger questions are between countries.
Lindsey, would you like to add on that, or?
Yeah, but it might just be a very specific UK point to speak to Christian's question. But you know, I think that within country stuff is where all the policy levers tend to be, right? So you need to be able to see within a place with the same institutions and government to be able to control these things. You know, that it's a very UK specific point, perhaps, given our relationship with the EU. But I just feel like it's a no-brainer to try and understand the differences. We do have big differences across the country here as well in terms of within country variations. So maybe it's particularly unique, but I think there's a lot of work to be done. We still don't understand why some areas are so far behind other areas in terms of their mobility prospects.
Thank you. Louis-André, you are the next one.
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this webinar and also for organizing this handbook I discovered together today, in fact, and the content looks quite brilliant. I think I agree with all that you said, and especially about the importance of investing in education of high quality and reducing inequalities in education. And I will be brief, but we know that essentially inequalities in education are composed of two things: inequalities of performance between children from different social backgrounds, and at a given level of performance inequalities in orientation plans or decisions. So on both aspects, I think teachers can make a difference, and research and in educational science, for instance, shows that not all teachers are equal in terms of increasing in the competences of the children and making, in fact, lessening differences between children. So this is my first question. What do you want to say about the importance of teachers? Do you agree with me about this aspect? And second brief question, do you think there is a paradox between the importance of teachers and the fact that in many countries, in fact, including France, we now have difficulties to recruiting, in fact, teachers and attracting good students who can make a difference for young children, in fact, towards this profession. So thank you in advance for your insights.
Thank you. Jani, you would like to reply?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's actually a great point. And this is, of course, also a bit touchy issue that how much should we expect the teachers to take care of this? So what we know, I mean, there have been quite a bit of this different kind of intervention studies already done in education. what we see that people had high hopes of this information in interventions, and those seem to be like having zero effect of actually equalizing education, the educational entry. The teachers' variation, I'm not sure how much that is actually. Look at that. Look this far. I mean, there are of course good question how much teachers want them to be in that kind of a role, but definitely there's a quite good evidence already that the tutoring or the benefits of tutoring. But that's research. I think it's still kind of a preliminary. We really don't know how effective that is, and especially the cost effectiveness is a great question. So maybe there's something better to come. And the question is, I am pretty sure that the answer won't be that we would kind of put greater role, put more emphasis on the role of teachers, but rather than maybe we have to channel some of the more resources on the tutoring part of the system, and let's see how that pans out.
Joe.
Sorry, I can't my button. Yeah, I would probably disagree slightly with Jani on that. I think there's fairly good evidence to say that teachers matter quite a lot. If you know, there's quite a good one will make quite a big difference to test scores, but you have to be fairly ruthless about finding the good ones in order to do that, which is very difficult. I mean, you're speaking from Finland, I'm speaking from the UK. I think we've got probably quite a difference in the way that we recruit and retain teachers, and we're actually facing quite an almost extreme teacher shortage in the UK. So again, that's a focus of the election as well. So I think teachers do make a difference. I think the evidence on tutoring is relatively good, but you have to do it well. And the evidence is teachers matter, but they have to do it well. So the challenge is to actually operationalize those things and potentially put some money into them, which is not what's happened in the UK of late.
Thank you. We are running short of time, but I still want to give the floor to Lindsey and Markus to add to that, and then we'll finish our session.
I'll be really brief, just to build tiny points on what Joe was saying, which is I think the evidence is more convincing now about the importance of high quality teachers, particularly for disadvantaged students and the support they give disadvantaged students. So that's the equalising kind of element of the importance of teachers here. And I think that one of the problems that we have in this evidence base is that just very strong power of unions not being able to link teacher data to pupil data. But evidence from the US I find fairly convincing on this.
I'm a little like a one-trick pony here, but I mean, where do good teachers come from? Well, they come from teacher education, and teacher education again recruits students from schools. So if you want to invest in teacher quality, you have to attract good students into teaching education, and you do that. Exactly how you do that is something of an open issue, but I think that there are quite clear differences across countries in what kind of students are attracted to school, and I think we do well to better understand things. But even if we today succeed in attracting better students into school, it'll take 5 to 6 years before they're actually in school, and so on. So the time lags really are quite considerable here. Everybody hopes that there'd be like a magic wand you can just wave around and then tomorrow everybody would have a brilliant teacher, but that's not how it works.
Thank you, Markus. It's a pity that we have to finish now. I would like to thank enormously our speakers, panelists, and all of you for joining us today. You stay tuned to our Mapineq project. We ask you in the registration if you'd like to subscribe to the newsletter. We keep you informed there, but you can also get informed by checking the website from time to time. The publications, they are being uploaded quite frequently, so it's a good thing to check the Mapineq website. I hope to see you in our future events. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.